Oh, there we go. Someone's in the chat. Northfield, Massachusetts. We're landowners. So feel free to put in the chat where you're from and if you're landowners or not. That's the questions we're doing while we're waiting. Get started. Okay, it is 7:03, so we're gonna get started here. And forgive me if I have to pause while I'm talking in this introduction while I admit people. Sometimes I can't do two things at the same time. Other times I can, depends on the day. Oh, more people in the chat. Great, thanks. So yeah, let's get started. So I'm just gonna do a quick introduction. I know some of you I see some familiar faces, so you know me already. I am Kelly Bierman. I'm your host for this evening, and I am also the Conservation Director for Nineveh Foundation. So it's nice to see all of you here tonight. And before I hand it over to our guest speaker, Hannah, I just wanted to do a short introduction for folks who may be unfamiliar with Nineveh Foundation. So we are a small nonprofit conservation organization, and we have a mission dedicated to promoting wilderness and wildlife habitat, as well as providing opportunities for outdoor recreation and education here in Vermont. And Nineveh Foundation is affiliated with Farm and Wilderness, also a nonprofit summer camp organization providing outdoor experiential education for youth ages 4 through 17 since 1939. And both organizations are linked with a shared desire and mission dedicated to environmental stewardship and collectively manage almost 5,000 acres of conserved forest in Mount Holly and Plymouth, Vermont. If you are unfamiliar with either organization, I'm going to put the websites as well as my email information in the chat. Afterwards, it's up on the screen there, but sometimes it's easier to get it from the chat, so I'll put it there. Just a couple quick reminders before we start the chat with Hannah is just keep your mics on mute if you can, please, and put all comments and questions in the chat box for me. We will do a question and answer time at the very end when Hannah is done speaking, and I can list out the questions that you have. Let's see, we are recording this session and we will post it on the website, on our website, on YouTube, so people can find it afterwards. So just be aware of that. And then finally, I just want to give a big thank you to Hannah for taking the time to talk with us this evening about forests. Hannah is the Southern Windsor County Forester for the Vermont County Forester Program. And the town of Plymouth is in her jurisdiction, and Nineveh Foundation and Farm and Wilderness both have land in Plymouth. So she is a really wonderful resource for organizations like us, as well as other landowners in the state, particularly in Windsor County. And, you know, as a resource for, you know, federal and state programs like Use Value Appraisal Program, otherwise known as current use. And I've also been to a couple talks with her as a guest speaker, and she's just a wealth of forestry knowledge and just a really great educator. So I really appreciate her taking the time out tonight again. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Hannah. I know she has some slides she wants to share, so let me do a couple things here so I can stop presenting my slides. And then Hannah, you should be good to go to present yours.
All right.
And I'm gonna go on mute.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for showing up tonight. And
Sorry, Hannah, can you unmute yourself again? That was my fault. Go.
Yes, sorry. All right, let me share my screen and we'll get going. All right, there we go. Is that, Kelly, can you see that?
Yes, I can see it. I didn't know if you just wanted, if you wanted to do slideshow view or if you just want to do it right from the PowerPoint, but I can see it.
Are we doing slideshow view? I think I want to do slideshow view. Is this it?
If you go to slideshow at the top.
12 o'clock, Hannah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just says, I'm sorry, it says end slideshow. Display. Here, I'm sorry, let me end. How's that? Can you see that now?
Yes, it is, I think, your slideshow view. It could also be that you're sharing a different screen than you want to. So you could.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Take your
we
time.
had it before. Let's see. Let me just end that. Let me try this again. And then is this the slideshow view again?
It's from the PowerPoint, but I think this works.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
I'm not sure what happened there, but this is the only option it's giving me. So
we can see the slides and all the visuals. It just has a little extra, that's all. You're good.
Okay. All right, well, we'll get started. Sorry to keep everybody waiting. All right, so my topic tonight is promoting resiliency and health through active forest management. So, you know, I am a big promoter of managing forests for health and resiliency. There is a lot of reasons you might manage a forest, but this is something I'm really passionate about, and trying to help forest buffer stresses that they might face. And so I'll go through some of those stresses. And so I'm sorry. This has thrown me off a little bit, but you know, we'll go through these stresses. So a common stress is climate change, and what that means for forests and the impact it has on forests is, you know, we're getting a lot of warmer weather, droughts. We're getting droughts mixed with heavy rainfall in the Northeast. So we'll have long periods and then really heavy rainfall, less snow cover throughout the winter. And often we're getting more high wind events. And then another series of stressors are invasive pests, and that can mean plants. So we might have, you know, invasive plants. There also might be invasive diseases. So there's a picture of a chestnut that is up at the top. That's, you know, got chestnut blight, and that's an invasive disease. And then there's also invasive insects, and that last picture on the bottom is an ash tree infested with emerald ash borer. And so we've got this set of stressors. And then finally, you know, our past land use history in New England is one of kind of intensive agriculture, where, you know, in Vermont, we had 80% of the forest was cleared, and it was used really intensely. And then, and these are great pictures of dioramas from the Harvard Forest, and it shows kind of the intensive agriculture and clearing. And then not long after, we had this abandonment And in Vermont, that was about 100 years ago. It varies. And in some places it was overnight, and other places it was kind of slowly as fewer and fewer cows were pastured or fewer and fewer sheep. And then in some other areas, there was also this history of high grading. So taking the best trees, leaving the worst, and doing that for, you know, a number of entries into the forest leaves a forest in kind of a weaker state. And so all of these things together, we can see this picture. This is pretty classic white pine that has some hardwoods growing up, but also a lot of invasives in the understory. This is this white pine all grew up after it was abandoned agricultural land. And this is a kind of the perfect storm of what I'm talking about, where we have these stresses in our forest. So this is a picture of some pasture pine, understory of invasive plants. So it's all buckthorn under there. And then we had a microburst wind event. And so all that's getting, you know, released with that added sunlight from that wind event is these invasive plants. And so they're already there established, and that's what they're going to, that's what's going to take over and fill that site. And so, you know, if enough of this area, if this happens to enough area, that's no longer forest land, and it can be a really, like I say here in the text, it's these compounding stressors that can create problems that are really difficult to fix. And so, you know, two big questions are, what does a healthy forest ecosystem look like? And then also, why does a healthy forest ecosystem buffer stress better? And the answer, kind of shortly, although it's pretty complicated, but quick answer is diversity. And so a healthy forest ecosystem is an ecosystem that's really diverse. And that diversity allows that forest to buffer different stresses in lots of different ways, you know, through species diversity, age class diversity, structural diversity, and I'll go through those in a little bit more detail as I discuss how you might actually apply those on the ground. And I'm also happy to kind of come back to any of these pieces of this slideshow in the questions later. But, you know, what does a healthy ecosystem look like? Diversity. So, you know, here's a beautiful picture of a forest. You can see there's multiple age classes. There's some, you know, wet forest ground where there's a stream. You can see some coarse woody debris. You can see that there's some deciduous trees. There's a few coniferous trees in there. You can see that there's lots of understory species also. And so that's all really healthy stuff. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. And a lot of these examples that I'll give, that's what we're going for in a lot of cases, things like that. Here's another picture of diversity where they did a patch cut here. And so they opened it up and they've added a new age class. So this forest where this patch cut took place was all one age class. And so they've added that, and in adding a new age class, they've also added a whole bunch of new species. And then here's another example where you've got diversity of species. This one's lacking some understory because it was pretty dense in there, and that's why you can see that there's a lot of trees down. This area was thinned with the hopes of kind of getting some more regeneration in there. But you can also see that there is quite a diversity in tree sizes. And so you've got some really big legacy trees and then some smaller trees. And again, the hope is to get even another age class in there. And another one, I love pictures of healthy forests. They're not always easy to come by, but another area where they've done a small group here. Right now, it's all like grasses and forbs, and soon this will regenerate. There's some berries in there, and soon there'll be more trees. And so you can see also beyond, kind of in the distance of this picture that there's another light patch beyond there. And so they've added a lot of patchiness, which is really beneficial to, again, buffering stressors so that not all the trees are the same age class. And, you know, if a wind event came through here, maybe some of those bigger trees would tip over, but they've still got another age class started, and it's got more capability of buffering something like that. And so the kind of key to this slideshow, or what I'm hoping to accomplish, is to give everybody out there some ideas of what some of our goals are when we do active forest management, and then ways that you can actually, as a landowner or as, you know, a community member, participate in accomplishing some of those goals, or also why you might see some of these activities taking place. So it's sometimes if you don't understand why an activity is taking place, like something like a patch cut, it can be quite shocking, but there's actually a lot of really, you know, great benefits from things like that. And my hope is through this slideshow that I can, you know, expose you to some of those benefits and why when you pass something like a patch cut, you can, you know, see the benefits of that. How's this going for everybody? Can you read it all right? Kelly, is this okay? Oh, you're on mute, but I think your thumbs up. Okay. All right, so, you know, the big one, a lot of people are aware of this, but promoting native species is kind of a really easy one to tackle. When our forests have invasive species in the understory, that immediately takes away their capacity to, you know, grow new trees, grow any sort of understory plants. It really limits, you know, we think of forests, I think of forests as having multiple layers. And so you've got kind of upper canopy, and then hopefully you've got lots of layers in between the upper canopy and the ground and what's growing on the ground. When you have invasives filling, you know, 1 to 2 of those layers from the ground layer up into the mid canopy, you're immediately getting rid of diversity in that way. So these invasives are often, you know, coming in monocultures and out competing lots of native species. I'm sure most of you are aware of the detriments of invasive species if you've been on any forestry or environmental talks. And so I won't go through all of those, but this is, you know, easy one to tackle. So you can see in this slide, both, you know, a couple of these understories, excuse me, are just filled with, you know, the bottom one is Japanese barberry, and then there's some honeysuckle, and then the one with the dripping blue dye is bittersweet. And so promoting native species, that means, you know, invasive plant control. And then another thing you can do once you've controlled the invasives is do some planting of native species. And those are kind of your two active management techniques. You know, invasive species control can mean lots of different things. And generally it's not meaning that you're eradicating those species completely, but there's lots of different techniques for how you might control those invasives. But and that again is kind of a topic for another time. There's lots of information out there, so I won't dive into that too deeply. But here's a picture of some a red maple that was planted once the invasives in this area were controlled and removed. And so that's a, you know, getting something in there to take the place of those invasives is really beneficial. Another thing you can do, kind of on top of invasive control, is encouraging species diversity. So that can mean invasive control. It can also mean things like crop tree release, thinning, planting or transplanting, so you can, you know, add some species into a forest. can mean browse control, so controlling what deer are eating and how they're doing that. And it can also mean using multiple harvest techniques. And so I'll go through a couple of those as we go through the next few pictures. So here is crop tree release and thinning. So you're selecting your trees that you want to leave or your trees that you want to remove, depending on different criteria, and you're giving them more space. And so you can choose trees that are, you might only have a few of in your forest and really encourage them. In this picture on the right, you can see that the orange slashes across them means to remove. And the trees that they're choosing to leave are some oaks, and I think also a few black birch and hemlock that they don't have a lot of in this forest. And so they're promoting certain ones through actively getting rid of other trees that are competing and are more prevalent in this forest. And here's a really, I think, beautiful picture of what some crop tree release actually looks like. So you're taking a really crowded area of the forest, and you're giving those trees some more growing space. So when we have a whole stand of trees that's all tightly packed together and they're all competing, some of them are going to lose out naturally. And what we do when we're doing crop tree release or thinning is we're just giving those trees that we want, that maybe aren't there because the seed source wasn't there when it grew up from a pasture. Maybe there's just one or two and we're giving them a little bit of an edge. And so you can really tweak the species diversity and really help some things along. And, I think it just looks lovely when you can look up and really see that that tree has room to grow. So another, I'm sorry, let me just go back here and talk. So when I also talked about, using other harvesting techniques, so that can also mean promoting species diversity by choosing different types of cuts. So if everybody ever did was these kind of light touch single tree selection forestry techniques, we would only get trees that like that kind of shade level. So we would only ever see trees being promoted that are the later successional trees. And if we want to have this diversity of species, we need to be creating smaller gaps, larger gaps, where some of those trees like birches and aspens that really like sunlight can get in there. And so, assisting species diversity in the forest can mean doing heavier cuts to get those things growing. So another goal we might have is creating age class diversity. And so we might be harvesting to add a new age class. So like I said, Vermont's forests and most of New England's forests grew up all once they were abandoned from agriculture, and that was about 100 years ago. So most of our forests are about 100 years old, and they're all the trees are about 100 years old. And you might notice that some of the trees are bigger and some of them are smaller, but that generally means in these abandoned agricultural fields and now forests that just some of those trees aren't as healthy and aren't thriving. So, generally if we were to core into them, they're mostly the same age. And so we can create some canopy gaps and do some things to tweak and add new age classes. And then once we get those age classes established, we can continue with some uneven age silvicultural techniques. So some of the more later touch techniques where you are just creating smaller gaps, but you need to get those age classes in there in the first place after this agricultural abandonment. And so this picture also, I think this picture is kind of cool. It's the tree in the foreground, you can see it has two scars on it, which indicates that there's two harvests that have happened in the past, like in this tree's lifetime. And so that's something that we call a buffer tree. And so when they're pulling trees out of the woods, because they've harvested them in there and they're taking them out for a product, that tree was left to, you know, buffer the trees beyond it. And I just think it's cool. It shows really the history of that forest. And so here's another picture of a shelter wood. And so this is leaving, you know, some trees and leaving them to provide some shelter for the next generation, but it's letting a lot of light. This forest was very dense before, and these trees were all the same age, and so it's letting a lot of light in to add some new diversity and a new age class in this forest. Again, this is a picture of a patch cut, and you can just see all of the you know, young trees that are growing up, and in the background you can see what the you know, what the area looked like around it. And so just adding some structure in that forest and adding some new age classes. So another thing that we are often trying to do is decrease a beech monoculture. And so beech has been infected by an invasive pathogen, which creates, you know, a lot of stump sprouts and creates this beech understory thicket, which, you know, in some areas can be okay. A lot of wildlife use those areas for cover, but it can also be, you know, like any monoculture, it can be detrimental to the forest. It changes the, you know, when you get years and years and years of nothing but beech leaves hitting the forest floor, it changes the soil composition, and it doesn't allow other things to get in there that normally would be in that beech mix. And that's because it's not acting like beech usually would if it wasn't for this pathogen. And so, you know, I also have in parentheses, or a lack of hardwood diversity in an understory. Beech is also a non-preferred browse species by deer, which can put a hurt on a lot of hardwood regeneration. And so they can, you know, through selecting other species, can promote it. That can happen also with black birch. Deer don't prefer black birch. And so by not eating the black birch and eating everything else, you can start to get a monoculture of certain species, but, you know, most of the time it's beech. And so, you know, decreasing that and a way to actively manage, I guess, against that, but for hardwood diversity and other species diversity, is to do beech control, which means cutting beech at certain times of the year, kind of going through the understory and just cutting it with a brush saw. It can also mean browse control. And so oftentimes that means, you know, promoting hunting, allowing people to hunt on your land, maybe not posting it, or just allowing some hunters to be there. It can also mean group cuts, because beech is very shade tolerant. And so that means it can hang out in really low light conditions. And if you make a big enough hole in the canopy, like this, this large group cut that's shown, then you're going to get other things that are able to get in and grow in the sunlight where beech can't grow in the pure sunlight in a large enough hole. But if you make a very small hole, like my last bullet is, you know, not doing single tree selection harvest without beech control where beech is present. And so those light touch harvests where beech is present, you're just going to get beech back in those areas. And so you need to use different tools. If your goal is to, you know, decrease a monoculture of beech, you will need to be looking at kind of different tools and a light touch, because the only thing that will come in where beech is present in a low shade condition is more beech. And so it's just being aware of kind of what your goal is and then how you are going to achieve that goal. And so here is a picture. This is close to the same spot. And there you can see how thick it is with beech in the understory. And then there was a crew that went through with brush saws and laid down all of that beech. And you can see you know, they don't cut. They're all foresters or coming out of forestry school, and they aren't cutting anything that isn't beech. And you can see that, you know, you can see pretty far in that forest now without all that beech in the understory. And so the hope is that you cut down the beech understory and you can get other things that seed in there. And there's quite a bit of success with timing that cutting the beech at, you know, right after it leaves out and all the carbohydrates are in the leaves. If you cut it, then you can knock it back and you can start to promote, you know, the other species in the forest that would naturally be there and better balance that forest. So another thing, you know, with climate change, we talked about having these really droughty summers, and then also these really high intensity rain events. And so we might have a couple months of no rain, and then all of a sudden we get like 2 to 4 inches. And that can wreak a lot of havoc on a forest where it's, you know, stressing the trees because they haven't gotten rain. And then when we finally do get that rain, it just runs off the forest floor and it can create some erosion and really pick up some velocity. And so ways to buffer against that is to recruit coarse woody debris, which means kind of larger, you know, coarse woody. Recruit those on the forest floor. It can also be recruiting fine woody debris by leaving tops when you harvest and not having them cut down. You know, traditionally, a lot of people have thought that it looks a lot better in their forest after a harvest to have those tops lopped down and cut up. But the bigger you leave them and the higher you leave them, the more they buffer the effects of just like mulch on your garden. You know, putting big layers of that across the forest floor allows them to retain moisture and buffer that better. And then another technique that I think is pretty cool and I've seen some people do is when you have a really steep slope and you start to notice some kind of surface runoff on that area, you might be able to lay some big pieces of coarse woody debris along that contour and intercept the surface water runoff. You can also do that with smaller pieces. It doesn't have to be really big pieces, but you're just kind of slow down and add more carbon and debris to the forest floor that can slow down that rain. And then, you know, I will promote this over and over again, species diversity. You know, if you have a species that is really stressed out by drought and it starts to decline or even die in some cases, you want to make sure that you have other species there to take its place. If you have just one species of tree in your forest or in a certain area, and those get really heavily stressed by drought, which we're seeing more and more, a lot of ash is declining because of drought, then it's going to be, you know, it's going to be stressed and you want something else there to be able to take its place or just kind of hold the ground for a while until other things can bounce back. Maybe you have a couple of drought years, things start to decline, you got something else there for when it starts to bounce back. So here's a great picture of a patch cut where they came in, they did a patch cut here to get some species diversity, but they also just left a lot of that wood on the forest floor, and that coarse woody debris will break down. It also buffers against deer browse in those areas because they can't get right in there. And so a lot of these are kind of, you know, overlapping and will achieve multiple effects and is all good ecological forestry. So here's another where the species diversity, it's a little hard to tell in this picture, I know, but there was so many different kinds of trees coming up in this patch cut. And so another thing that's on a lot of people's minds right now with emerald ash borer is, you know, trying to be a little bit more conservation minded about ash. When we had chestnut blight come through in the 30s, everybody went out and just cut all the chestnut before it died. And because they're so worried that all of it was going to die. And we're now realizing from, you know, kind of looking back at some of our mistakes, there's a lot more resistance to chestnut blight than we thought, or we as you know, past humans thought. And so we're trying to be a little bit better about it with ash, and we know that there is some genetic resistance. And so we understand that people will want to recoup some of their economic value, but there are things that you can do to kind of throw the ash regeneration into the future and hope that some of that genetics gets carried along, while also harvesting some of your ash and, you know, selecting certain ash trees to leave in a more methodical way. And so one of those things is group and patch cuts around ash, because ash needs a lot of sunlight to grow. And so you can see this main tree is an ash, and you can see how little its canopy is up there. But it's roughly, one ash tree needs roughly 1/4 acre of sunlight to grow. And so, you know, the canopy, if you just let this tree die because of emerald ash borer, it gets infested and it dies. Or if you just come in here and harvest it to recoup the economic value, the canopy gap that leaves isn't going to allow for more ash to regenerate on that site. And so we need to actively be recruiting ash in groups. And so you can create a canopy gap group around this ash tree, let it seed for a year and then take it, or just leave it and sacrifice it to emerald ash borer. And then the other thing, and so yeah, here's another example of the smaller canopy you see on an ash tree, and the gap size you need to get more than a few ash to regenerate. And then the other thing is invasive species control with ash. If we want to promote ash into the future, the canopy gap that will be created through ash just dying without creating larger gaps is the perfect size and shade amount for invasives that are hanging out in the understory to just fill that gap really quickly. And they're already there poised to fill it. And, you know, we could lose all of our ash and have an invasive problem on our hands if we're not careful. And so it, you know, it actively takes management to kind of fight against those factors if we want to be a little bit more conservation minded about ash. You know, here's, I don't know, another example of an acre patch cut with this note where it's tied into another existing patch cut. So you can kind of see it down in the, you know, southwest corner of that. And so you can start to layer these on top of each other and use trees around the outside to seed in and hopefully get more ash on the landscape before it gets wiped out by emerald ash borer. And another goal is to create some more structurally diverse stands. And so a lot of our old growth stands that we don't have very much of, but are very interested in protecting and recruiting, are so special because they are structurally very diverse. And so what that looks like in our kind of one age, young, relatively young forest post agricultural abandonment is that we need to be really recruiting coarse woody debris, recruiting fine woody debris, retaining a lot of legacy trees. So those are kind of your big tree, some of your biggest trees in the forest, and saying like, these are special and we want to keep them forever. And then, you know, recruiting more snags, so that's standing dead. So that's what you see here with the G's on these trees, or girdle. And so that's recruiting standing dead trees. And then also adding in a lot of group cuts to add some structural diversity. So this diagram I think is really great and illustrates, you know, spatial patchiness and multiple canopy layers and what that means when you're looking at a forest. And it often means taking an area that has none of that and adding it by doing active forest management. And this is a great picture of what I would call a legacy tree, but people, might look at this and think that it's, oh, this is old growth, but you can actually tell because of how many branches it has and how low the branches are, that this was a tree that was present during the agricultural times. And so this was an open grown tree. Still really cool to preserve, but even this tree isn't kind of virgin old growth forest. And so we're still working from a point where a lot of what we're working with is relatively new post agricultural abandonment. And here is yet another series of pictures of some group and patch cuts. And so on the before picture, you can see it was all very much the same age class, one species. This is white pine. And you can see afterwards, I love to show this picture because, afterwards it doesn't look so great. It looks pretty bare. But then just 1.5 years later, I went back to the same spot. You can see the same forked pine tree in the background. And it is green and it's got so much diversity in there. And it's only gonna, this was, I would say probably 4 years ago. I haven't been back, but it's gonna be head high. Things grow back really quickly. Here's another picture of, you can just see that this is when this regrows, it's going to add a lot of diversity to this site. All right, so let me take another sip of tea before we go through these final kind of takeaway thoughts, and then we'll get into some questions. All right, so a lack of forest management can really have some negative effects on our forests, especially when when we're dealing with invasive species in a lot of our forests. And invasive species that, love to take advantage of these kind of low light conditions of an unmanaged forest. And so, a hands-off approach really only works when you start with a perfectly functioning ecosystem, and we're not at this point because of this history that we have in New England. And so we disrupted these systems a long time ago, and I believe that it's really our duty as stewards of the land to work hard to learn from some of the mistakes. And the ways that we're doing that is, science is always evolving, and the practice of forestry is now much more holistic than it used to be. And so we're getting input, I get input as a forester from biologists, wildlife experts, climate change experts. It's really we are actively seeking the input of lots of different folks that have a vested interest in the health of the forest. And a lot of what I like to promote and believe is that forestry can really be a restorative practice and bring a lot of balance back to our forests that they used to have and haven't had for a while now. And so a lot of these activities in active forest management are to bring some of that balance back. And then lastly, we need our forests for their reusable and sustainable resource. And we can grow that resource here, right in our own backyards or across the state. And if we do that here, and we know that we're doing our best to, be very thoughtful in how we're using these resources, then we're not going to be outsourcing a lot of, negative externalities where if you think like not in my backyard and say like, oh, they can harvest wood somewhere else. We don't know how that's being done. We don't know what sort of folks are being kind of exploited for their labor. We know that here in Vermont and across New England, we have a lot of, you know, a lot of pride in how we can get this work done within our own communities and how we can get it done very sustainably. And so I think that's important to bring into the conversation, is this idea of, you know, using our local resources and being very aware of, you know, when you see where the wood comes from, you can also be very aware of what you're consuming and how you're consuming it. So this, you know, I'll take some questions now, but I also want to, for anybody that's curious, this picture down here is the towns that I cover. I know it's pretty small now. It was small to begin with. But this is the area of Vermont that I cover. So, you know, down in the lower right is Springfield, and the upper left is, what is that? That's Bridgewater there. So if you are in one of these towns, then I am your county forester. So I'll leave that, and happy to talk through questions and any sort of nuance that anybody wants to talk over.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really interesting and informative. I know a lot of the things that you mentioned throughout your talk. Nineveh Foundation, for example, has, you know, some goals, and in the ways that we do timber harvests, you know, some of the things that you mentioned, we implement. For example, we have a harvest that we just started, and we're looking to promote more yellow birch, and there is a lot of beech that we are removing in that process. And it is, for those of you who live up by Lake Nineveh, I know there's a few of you, when you go out there, you know, this summer or in the winter, it probably will look like some of the pictures Hannah showed. It'll make look a little messy. We have some of that coarse woody debris like piled up right now, and it's pretty high. But again, that's to help with that browsing, and also for the buffering. So so if you are up and around that area and you want to take a walk over there, I think we'll do that this summer. You'll see some of the things that Hannah is talking about actively happening on that spot. So I just want to mention that because I know there are a few people who live in that area. Okay, so I do want to get some time for questions for Hannah. If you would like to put some questions in the chat, I'm happy to voice them for you. Otherwise, if you want to raise your hand, there's the raise hand option. We can call on you and you can unmute. So I do see that it looks like Thomas, you have your hand raised. Did you want to unmute and ask a question for Hannah?
Yes, if I may. These aren't located clearly. Are any of the slides you've shown closer to the Nineveh area?
I'm sorry, are any of them shown close to the Nineveh area? Is that the question?
Right. Are these, from our viewpoint, local scenes?
They are. I mean, they are taken, some of them were taken when I was the NRCS forester, which was my previous position. So I was working for the state, but I was covering kind of Addison County. Some of them are from Addison County. Some of them are from Windham County. A lot of them are from Windsor County.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Thomas, if you are interested, I do have a few photos of some harvests that we've done recently. So if you'd like to see photos of those, just feel free to email me. I'm happy to share examples of that might be a little bit closer to where you are, up around Lake Nineveh for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I would say all of the photos are from southern Vermont. None of them are from any further away than kind of southern Vermont. Maybe Addison County is the furthest.
Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions they want to raise their hand or put in the chat about anything Hannah's chatted about or anything you think she might know about? Yes. Oh, okay, Betty, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, this is really interesting. I'm also up by Nineveh. And I'm interested in hearing any other resources or tips in regards to controlling the beach, because we have beach unbridled in parts of our land. We have about 9 or 10 acres on the side of a tiny mountain.
Sure. So, you know, one of the ways that you can control beech is through cutting it just about any time of year and then applying an herbicide to the cut stump. That is a very effective way to control it. You don't have to hit every stem either. It will, the beech is such a problem because it sprouts from its roots, and a lot of it is root grafted, and it's you know, coming from sprouts. And so using an herbicide will move that through the beech that is there. It's roughly within 30 feet of a larger beech, you'll get all those sprouts. So that's a very effective way. But there's also some really, really promising research that if you cut the beech basically right after it's leafed out, so in the summer, as soon as it puts all the energy it has stored in its roots into its leaves, if you go through and cut the beech, and you have to be pretty ruthless with it, but cut all the beech sprouts in a given area, you can really reduce the amount of beech that comes back in that area. And so if you do that for like 1 to 2 years, the goal is, you know, the goal of beech control is to never completely eradicate beech. It's a natural, you know, it's a native species, but
It's a nice tree.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be a beautiful tree before beech bark disease. And so, you know, we aren't looking to get rid of it completely, but we are looking with, you know, with ecology in mind, we're looking to kind of put it in check, you know, and not have it as a monoculture and, you know, take over. And so the idea is that if you cut it back, especially those sprouts that are preventing other things from growing in the understory, cut it back for a few years until you can get some other things established, then you can have more of a balanced ecosystem, and some of those things will get established and you know, keep their space, hold their space. But when you just have such a understory of beech, nothing can ever get in there and regenerate with such dense, you know, low light conditions. And so, yeah, it really is managed.
Okay.
It's
I think we have to, you know, we're part of, you know, we would coordinate with Kelly and Silas, I think,
Yep.
before going ahead with some. But I'm just looking. It was interesting that, you know, cutting it after leaf out was a good strategy. So yeah, we wouldn't do anything without checking, but just looking for some more tips of what we could be discussing. So thanks.
Yeah, and with beech, it's controlling light conditions, and with a lot of forestry, it's controlling and tweaking light conditions so that you're triggering certain species to grow. And so with the beech, it is so good at growing in shade conditions that create shade for everything else, and nothing else can get going.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really great. Okay, does anybody else have any questions for Hannah right now about anything? Put in the chat, raise your hand. If not, I might have a couple questions for you, Hannah.
Kelly.
Yes.
This is Betsy and Hannah. So Hannah, do you have a picture, and Kelly, of what the mix of trees around Lake Nineveh should be? Is there an ideal picture of what we should be aiming for?
Hannah, I'll let you speak generally about, like, you know, your area that you cover in terms of like the state of Vermont and the goals on a county level, and then I can speak to a little bit what's in some of our specific stewardship plans.
Sure. So it used to be that beech was kind of in a mix with sugar maple, yellow birch, you know, some ash, and then there used to be quite a bit of spruce also in these kind of mixed wood, older successional forests. They're also, you know, just having few of a lot of, basically as many as you possibly can get of different species. You know, if that's a few hemlock and a few anything, I would say, you've got this kind of like, generally you're going to have in a late successional hardwood forest or mixed wood forest, you're going to have sugar maple, beech, and birch. That's kind of your late successional, and then some spruce scattered in depending on your elevation. But then within that, the goal really is to have as many species as you can capture. And so the more, the better. And it used to be that our forests a long, long time ago had many more species as these, very small percentages, but they were present. And now you can have some areas where there just really isn't anything other than maybe, the beech and a few sugar maple or something like that. So the goal is really as much as you can get, but sugar maple, beech, birch is the climax.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that, is also true for what Nineveh Foundation is looking for in terms of goals, specific goals on our property. And I think like a lot of our forest is even younger than 100 years, because we've had a lot of agriculture around Lake Nineveh very recently, and so they're very young. So I think when we go to do a harvest, we take that harvest as a a single event, and we say, okay, what do we have here in this area, and what species do we want to promote here, with the goal of trying to get as many species, diversity as possible. And what are some things that we're seeing are kind of taking over, like the beech. We do have a lot of areas that right now that are still, we can see they're very young still, but they're if we let it go, the beech will probably take over. So while we're in there and we harvest, and we do, we make some income off of that as well. But the other bigger goal is to, when we leave that harvest, we are leaving it as a space that can promote and has the ability to bring a diversity of species in. We may not see our desired goal or final product until much, much later. But that's what we aim to see. So for example, this harvest that we're doing right now, I know Silas, our forester, is focusing on promoting yellow birch and taking down the beech a bit in that area. And we are taking some maple out, but whenever we see, some sugar maple, some red maple that are doing really well, and if they're being crowded or need some space to help them grow, for the future, then we'll create some space for them. So like when Hannah was saying about crop tree selection, we pay attention to what species we want to see thrive in that area. And also we pay attention to the different kinds of species. And if there's a lot of one, then we work hard to see if there's opportunities to promote the other ones that are also there in a lot of different areas. So yeah. Oh, yeah, see, Andy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it seems like we have so much beech in our woods that doing this sort of patch clearing, the odds of getting anything else growing there seem really small. Is there anything that can be done to sort of improve the odds of getting birch and maple and other things growing? Because it seems like you cut a patch and it's still just surrounded by more beech.
So if you cut a big enough patch, then the beech does not, cannot compete with other species when there's enough light. And so, smaller patches, because trees are tall and because the sun moves, can, if you have trees that are close enough together, you're going to end up with, quite a bit of shade in that patch from the surrounding trees. So you really need to create a big enough patch that they're not shading the center of that area. And so that's one way. So smaller patches, smaller groups, you are just going to get that beech filling in. But larger patches and groups, the beech just, it can't compete with things like, you know, paper birch. And even, you know, paper birch isn't necessarily our ideal species because it's pretty short-lived. But one of the things that can be part of beech management is just getting a large enough patch to get something else in there, because as I mentioned, the beech leaf litter year after year will change the soil composition, and that can make it harder for other things to grow. So you want to get a big enough patch, get some other things in there like some birches, paper birch, aspen. That leaf litter will create an environment where sugar maples can start to grow up in that shade condition under the birches or aspens and things like that. And so, like Kelly was saying, you might not see it right away, but it is a slow transition, and kind of having this longer term goal in mind to change the soil composition and then get something else after that as a kind of a third step is one way. You know, going in there and cutting it out, and then doing a harvest after it's been cut out for a few years can help get a seed bank of other things there, and then they can spring up when you release the canopy better than just having the beech sprouts present. And then another way is to really, you know, when you have big equipment, it can be doing some of the logging work. It can be really beneficial to tear up a lot of that beech material that's in the ground and kind of shred it and get it out of there, cut as much of it down as they can. And that can also help other species. Like birches really need a lot of mineral soil. Hemlock also needs a lot of mineral soil to get started, for the seeds to get started. And so, you know, working with that in mind and doing some active scarification of the ground so that you can get these seeds to take in that soil.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think for Niva's harvest, we've done some larger patches and some strips too that are large enough. When we go into an area, we're like, oh, we really got to make sure the beech doesn't come back in this area and give other species a chance. And if you are walking around the trails around Nineveh and you see some older, you know, an opening all of a sudden, like over to one side, you know, that's older, that's probably what that was. And you can go in there and see like, okay, what's growing here? And do I see some, you know, young beech, or are there other things coming up? So that's really fun to go find those in the woods around Lake Nineveh. And I do, if any of you are ever interested, I could specifically take you to some locations that we've done that, and you can see what the early succession species are. Okay, I know that it is 8:05, and I do want to be mindful of people's time. I do see we have 2 more questions, so I think we'll do that and we'll wrap up. So Thomas, I saw that your hand was up. If you want to ask the question.
Hannah, you and Kelly have inspired me to ask a very practical question. I know that between our house and the junction of Pool, Loop Road, and Dam Road is an incredibly dense patch of forest. And I would like to thin it out. And is there anyone that you know that would be able to do a walkthrough and sort of say this tree can go and this tree should stay?
So I can certainly come and help with that on a kind of very educational basic level. But there are lots of foresters, consulting foresters in the area, and I can provide anybody with a list of those that work in the area. And so I'm happy to kind of come out with anybody and kind of go over, here's how you might choose, just for general knowledge. Also, if you are interested in doing, you know, some landowners are interested in doing that work themselves, and so I'm happy to help them through that. And then for a more, you know, deeper dive, I can provide a list of consulting foresters who can help with that.
That would be great. Thank you.
And then I'll just tag on, not to say, like, Silas Roberts, some of you may know him. He is Nineveh Foundation's consulting forester. Occasionally, if he has time, if for folks that live around Lake Nineveh, he will do some consulting for you, especially since he's very familiar with the area, but he doesn't always have the time. So it would be good to get a list from Hannah too, so you have options if that's something you're looking into. But you can always email me, and I'm happy to pass Silas's information along to you as well as an option. So please feel free to do that. Okay, I'm going to go to the last question here before we wrap up. And Betty has a question about, what do you suggest as a big enough size patch that the beech won't regrow? So a very specific, direct question about the size. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I realized I hadn't mentioned that, and it can be shocking to some people, but we're looking at, you know, 1 acre to 2 acres is kind of your size that you're looking for when you're looking to outcompete the beech, or for things to outcompete the beech. And so, yeah, 1 acre can be pretty shocking, but that really is, you know, if you think about how much shade a tree will cast with its long shadow, you need to get a big enough opening so that none of the surrounding trees are getting shade to the middle of that area. And then not just having one tree growing that very middle area, but having, you know, enough trees grow to make it worth, you know, doing the activity. So yeah, you know, I would say 1/2 acre is minimum, but really 1 to 2 acres is ideal.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I'm going to wrap it up for tonight because we're now at 8:09. But you all have, you know, Hannah's email. I put that in the chat. It's also on, you know, Vermont website for county foresters if you Google it, and you have my email as well. So if you have more questions about Nineveh Foundation or just, you know, Vermont forestry in general, Hannah's a resource. I'm happy to point you in the right direction. So feel free to reach out. And I'm so appreciative of everybody coming here tonight. And Hannah, thank you again. This was really great. I enjoyed listening to all these really interesting topics, and it's something I'm certainly, you know, learning about as we, you know, work on the Nineveh Foundation land and beyond. So thanks again, and we'll see everybody later.
And I'm happy to share my slideshow with anybody that wants it for reference too. You can contact me and I'll send you a PDF version of that.
Thank you. That's really good to mention. Yeah. So yeah, I might do that myself. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.